Okay, let's look a little bit more closely at Hello World. This will just give us a couple of ideas about some of the things that we'll be seeing in C that are both the same and different than in MATLAB. So we already talked about how these pound include statements at the top include the libraries that we want to link in that include the functions that we'll be using in our code, the built-in functions. We don't get them the same way we did in MATLAB where we could just use them. We have to explicitly link to the libraries in C. Standard I/O and standard lib will include actually a lot of the functions that we want to use, and as we branch out and learn other functions, we'll talk about what other libraries we might need to include. Now, then the next thing that we see here is this function main. So this is a function syntax, and in the C we don't have the keyword function like we did in MATLAB, but this is the equivalent of a function header, just without the function keyword. The parts here are the return type of the function, so just the type of the variable, not the name of the variable, the function name, and then the parameter list. So here we have a function called main that takes 0 parameters and returns a variable of type int. Then everything that's part of the main function will be inside curly brackets. So we have to use these curly brackets to tell us what goes inside a function in C. In C, the main function is an important function that serves a special purpose. The main function is where your program starts executing when you go to run it. So since we're going to look for the main function as a place to start executing our code, every program has to have a main function. So here inside demo project, which is our project, right, there must be a main function. And in fact, there can only be one main function. We'll also get an error if there are more than one main functions. And that's because if we need to know where to start the program, there can really only be one entry point to the program. So that's just another thing to keep in mind when you start writing programs in C, that every program must have one and only one main function. Then this is a pretty simple function. So what it does is it prints something to the console. So we use printf, which looks a lot like fprintf did in MATLAB. The main difference here is that we're going to use double quotes instead of single quotes to enclose a string. We'll still use the same format specifier, so like the %d to insert an integer, or the %f to insert a floating point value will still work to insert values into the string, and we'll still use \n to indicate a new line. So another thing you might notice is that there's semicolon here, and that at first looks pretty similar to MATLAB, but in C the semicolons are required. So on most lines of code in C, it's required that you have a semicolon. There are a couple exceptions that we'll talk about later, but for now you should assume that all the lines of code that we're writing will have to have a semicolon at the end, and in fact, as we saw in the previous video, you might get an error if you don't have a semicolon. This last line provides the return value for the function. So in C, right, since we don't specify a specific variable to hold our return value, we have to explicitly say which value or variable we want to return. Here we're just returning 0, which usually indicates that our function exited without any errors or any problems. And so 0 is an integer. This function expects to return an integer. So that's an overview of the Hello World function. That is the sample function that's given to you whenever you start a new project in code blocks. It gives us an idea of what some of our C programs are going to look like, and gives us an idea of how C is going to be similar and also different from MATLAB.